welcome again to our live stream Encuentro. My name is Mariana del Valle Prieto Cervantes. I'm the Water Equity and Ocean Program Manager with GreenLatinos. I am really excited to be joining you all today so we can have a little bit of an overview of what's happening in Congress right now with the bipartisan infrastructure bill as with the budget resolution, and if that, in fact, what is happening there is going to be enough to help our Latino communities at the moment. We are joined by some incredible speakers today. Ian Tafoya, who is our Colorado director with GreenLatinos, Teresa Cardenas, who is an amazing advocate from New Mexico. She is currently the Civic Engagement and Policy Manager of Natural Resources and Agricultural Resilience for New Mexico First. And we also are joined by Didi Belmares, who is the Climate Justice Organizer for Public Citizens in San Antonio, Texas. So we're really excited to have everyone join us today. Feel free to drop on the chat or in the comment section where you're joining us from, your name, and what organization you're with. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ian Tafoya to give us a little bit of a welcoming, and then we'll get started on our event.
Hola, bienvenidos a todos. Yes, my name is Ian Tafoya, and I'm the Colorado State Director for GreenLatinos. It's really an honor to be here today because guess what? We've been doing the work for a long time, and we are at a moment in time where the next few weeks can mean a lot for our communities. It can mean a lot for reinvestment. It can mean a lot for wealth development and reduction of many of the problems that are causing our communities harm. So you're about to get briefed on something that is huge and like 1,000 pages long, but that's okay because we've done the work for you to try to break this down into bite-sized pieces. You know, we really want to acknowledge, first of all, that, you know, we're all on occupied, stolen indigenous land. My ancestors are Hickory, Apache, Noke, Winge, from the headwaters of the Rio Grande. And it has been such a great pleasure to be working along so many partners from the other two states along our river basin over the last year, trying to build relationships to build towards this goal right now of coming together with one unified voice and asking for better protections for our community. Now, it's going to take work. You know, it's in the middle of a work day right now. We know not everybody can tune in. It's not always that easy. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is to do your part by sharing this immediately, by taking the time to call your representatives and to call your senators to put the pressure on them now. In my life, and I'm only 35 years old, but my birthday is Earth Day. I've been tracking this for a lot of years. And this to me is the largest investment, the closest that we've ever been. And we need to keep pushing. You know, the foundation of what created GreenLatinos all the way back to Obama's administration. Yes, that was positive climate action we were working towards, but look at what that moment created. It created this network of GreenLatinos. It has brought us together. We are within orgs that are all working, and we are all carrying such a heavy burden of pushing for equity in every single conversation. But we were born for this moment. We would not be in these spaces if we were not meant to be. You know, we've had an opportunity, the staff of GreenLatinos recently, to travel to Washington, D.C. Mark Magana had an opportunity to talk at length with President Biden about these issues. What we know is that we are networked, we're educated, and right now we have access like we have not had previously. And so because of that, I need you to be joyful. I need you to be happy because this is the moment if we use positivity to reach out to our networks and we get the calls in, if we do the work, I do believe that we can change these bills for the better, that we can get more of what we need for our communities. You know, these are great investments, but why would we settle for crumbs when we can fight for so much more? And we have a couple weeks to do it. So again, I just want to say it has always been a pleasure to work for GreenLatinos. Before I found them, I think like so many, we maybe perhaps felt alone in our space, even within perhaps our own families being a little bit too much environmentalism for them. But remember that our ancestors were environmentalists, that they stewarded this planet. And this is a moment when everything is on fire. Here in Colorado, the air quality is worse than it's ever been. And it is our communities that are paying the high cost of housing to live in pollution, that are paying the high cost of medical bills and missed day of work because of the pollution that's impacting our communities. And we know that infrastructure is a big part of it. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it on to Mariana. You're going to hear more about my needs in Colorado and how I feel they're connected to everyone else later in the conversation.
Kind of getting us grounded so that we can talk about, what is happening and how we can really keep our communities in mind and what climate action through infrastructure and reconciliation bills is happening right now. So I'm going to give you an overview of that, and then we're going to turn it over to an amazing roundtable we have with Ian, Teresa, and Didi. So just a little bit of what is happening right now. You may have heard a lot of it in the news. There's the bipartisan infrastructure bill that just passed the Senate. The package is also known as the Infrastructure Invest in Jobs Act, and contains about $550 billion in entirely new investments. The bipartisan bill is a lot less than that 2.3 trillion Biden initially asked for in the spring, but it is still a significant amount of funding for the next 5 years. The senators often like to refer to this bill as the 1.2 trillion dollar package, because they are also counting funding that is normally allotted each year for highways and other projects. The spending is also mostly made up of without raising taxes, and the bulk of the funding comes from repurposing unspent coronavirus relief money and tightening enforcement on reporting gains from cryptocurrency investments. Keep this in mind that this is funding for the next 5 years. So what is in it? $110 billion for roads and bridges. This, in addition to construction and repair, the funding also helps pay for transportation research at universities, funds for Puerto Rico's highway, and congestion relief for American cities. It also includes $66 billion for railroads. Funding includes upgrades and maintenance of America's passenger rail systems and freight rail safety, but nothing for high-speed rail. $65 billion for the power grid. The bill would fund updates to power lines and cables, as well as provide money to prevent hacking of the power grid, and clean energy funding is also included. It also includes $65 billion for broadband, something that, during the COVID-19 pandemic, when we were all staying home, most of us, we saw a lot of this in our communities. And so it will provide $65 billion for broadband. Approximately $14 billion of the total would help reduce internet bills for low-income citizens. This is something, the water infrastructure is something that I work in a lot. So $55 billion will be going towards water infrastructure. It sounds like a lot, but it really is a small drop in the bucket, pun intended. This funding includes $15 billion for lead pipe replacements, but that is only covering about 25% of lead service lines and leaves 75% of existing lines untouched. It does include $10 billion for chemical cleanup. This includes PFAS and money to provide clean drinking water in tribal communities and rural communities. There is also a pilot, low-income water assistance program pilot under the EPA, but there is no money for it allotted for it. And there's no additional funding for the temporary relief under HHS for low-income household water assistance program. So there's lots of work to be done in order to ensure that everybody has access to water, clean, healthy, and affordable water. $47 billion will be going towards cybersecurity and climate change. The Resilience Fund will protect infrastructure from cybersecurity attacks and addressing flooding, wildfire, coastal erosion, and droughts, along with other extreme weather events. Like Ian was mentioning, here in the West, we're seeing a lot of wildfires. There is a lot of flooding that's happening in the East. So this is money that will be allocated towards that. $39 billion will go to public transit, $25 billion for airports, $21 billion for the environment. These monies would be used to clean up Superfund, brownfield sites, abandoned mines, and old oil and gas wells. This is more than the original proposal, so this is actually one of the bigger wins. There's going to be $17 billion for ports. Additional funds would go to Coastal Guard, ferry terminals, reduction for truck emission at ports, including $2.25 billion for port infrastructure development programs. That includes port electrification projects and $80 million per year for 5 years for reducing truck emissions at ports. There is also $8 billion for Western water infrastructure. Like we mentioned, droughts is a thing, especially here in the arid West. So there'll be some money going there towards Western water infrastructure. There is $7.5 billion in electric vehicle charging stations and $7.5 billion for electric school buses. This is great, but again, also just a drop in the bucket, and we need a lot more funding for that. And not last but not least, the last thing I want to mention is 1. At NOAA. We, along with more than 100 organizations, have asked for $10 billion for ocean and coastal restoration projects, which are already ready to go on the ground, just need the funding for it. So this 1.2 billion is a start, but we need a lot more, and we're hoping to get a lot more of that during budget reconciliation. So that's kind of the good stuff that's in it. A lot of it that's going to be helping our communities. We need a lot more investment, however, and unfortunately there is some bad things in this bill, such as investment for false solutions, which include carbon capture standards and chemical recycling, which the industry makes out to be a great way to recycle plastic, but in reality, it's just incineration. So what's missing from it other than what I kind of just mentioned? Clean energy, nearly $400 billion in clean energy tax credit are left out entirely from this budget infrastructure bill, bipartisan infrastructure bill. Renewable energy is cut to $0. So we're really hoping that reconciliation will likely and must fund a clean energy standard that moves us towards 80% carbon-free electricity by 2030. So that is our hope here. And again, this matters because the lack of investment, of direct investments in clean generating technologies could leave some areas of the country out of the economic investment benefits of this industry. The grid remains heavily carbon intensive in many regions in the US. In these areas, ratepayers remain saddled by higher bills from uneconomic coal plants. Frontline communities and communities of color, of course, are breathing dirtier air and suffer results of health impacts. And residents do not have access to jobs in the fast growing wind and solar industries, especially now that the Biden administration has invested already a lot in offshore wind energy. There's also a lot more funding that could go to clean transportation. I think the original ask was around $35 billion for mass transit. Only $2.5 billion for electric buses is currently what's in the bipartisan bill. And also only $7.5 billion for EV chargers. That's less than a fifth of what the EV analysts say would be necessary for a national build out. So there's a lot more that could be done when it comes to clean transportation. So what is next? Like I mentioned, a lot of this we hope is going to get into the budget reconciliation. Many of the key things that are missing could be passed through this, but Democratic leadership strategy is, their strategy is to pass budget reconciliation before passing the bipartisan infrastructure in the House, as this gives leverage over moderate members who may not want to vote for a broader reconciliation plan, in part because of its cost. 9 of these moderate Democratic members are vowing to vote against the budget reconciliation if the BIB is not passed first. And some of these Democratic members, are in places like Texas and Arizona. However, Progressive Caucus members have for some time been vowing to do some more to do the same if reconciliation does not pass first. So there's a lot that's up in the air right now. Markup is something that is next, and it's going to be happening in the next few weeks in a lot of different committees in the House. And so we're going to be seeing a lot of that movement. But as far as what's going to get voted on first, what's going to is for a lot of this to go into budget reconciliation, and some of the payment program, providing more clean energy, manufacturing, transportation, tax incentives, and grants, creating coastal and ocean resiliency programs, making more of an investment in the Department of Interior when it comes to drought and wildfire, in providing providing environmental justice and climate resiliency. So there's a lot that is going to be coming up in the next few weeks that we're hoping is going to kind of make up for what isn't on the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So this is sort of kind of a quick overview of what's going on, what's in it, what we're hoping gets into it. And from here, we're going to hear from both from Ian, from Didi, from Teresa on their thoughts when it comes to this. So I'll turn it back to Ian.
Well, thank you, Mariana, for that very detailed explanation of the bill. There's a lot in there. Even some jargony words like markup, where they're making changes to the bills and how they want to, spend the money. I just want to reiterate, like, this is a big deal. It's a big package. It's going to be moving through many places, and it's unfortunate that a few people are really in control of this fate of our planet. In a lot of ways, it feels that way to me. 9 people who can come together to block the much needed investments that we need in our community. I want to be clear, any of this rhetoric that talks about cost, we already know the costs of climate crisis. We see it every day, and we see the bills mounting. Even in the most conservative rural communities here in Colorado, we see a commitment to wanting to take climate action just on the fiscal needs alone. To build and have it, to build a road, have it destroyed by a fire, and then you get it fixed, and then it gets destroyed by a flash flood that's a result of the fire. These are the kinds of problems that we're seeing in our communities. And, it's, I think, something we can easily push back on, that the costs are too great not to act, that the math just doesn't add up. So we are gonna be pivoting, I think, to just some leading questions. And Teresa, I'm really interested in, what are some of the impacts you're seeing for your community, and what can this bill do to help you?
Let's see. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So let's see. The answer to that question, I'm going to focus my answers or my message on around agricultural resilience. So we're a land-based people in New Mexico, and our culture and historical values are really important to us. We have an ag plan in place, our state ag plan in place, to help us adapt and be more resilient to changes, as we see changes happening. So some of those changes are this mega drought that we're involved in, and it's really the entire western part of the United States and Northwest as well, affecting our surface and our groundwater supply, both the quantity and the quality, which is affecting farming and ranching and management of our lands, and affecting our biodiversity. So if ag is affected, that means that it affects our food supply chain, and it really affects the way that we address our hunger issues in New Mexico. And we are considered to be a food-starved state. We get 90% of our foods are imported. So we want to really focus more on local ag to help fulfill that gap. to feed our communities. We have less precipitation with an increase of monsoon flooding in certain parts of the state. We have this big tree die-off with an increase in forest fires. And this is affecting, peoples that are living, land-based peoples that are actually living near forests. You get post-fire flash flooding after a flood in response to sort of short durations of these intense rainfalls. And then you get erosion that goes along with that it just can last for decades. We have less of a snowpack affecting our surface and our groundwater supply, which is affecting a shorter agricultural season. So we're one month late to grow and 1 month short to, they stop irrigation. They're stopping irrigation 1 month sooner. We've had these huge changes in biodiversity. Our watersheds are at risk from forest fires and from the impacts from ongoing warming and sort of this severe drought, which I'll give you an example. It's causing these sand dunes that are burying roads and threatening homes on reservations. So anyway, that's kind of a spectrum of all the things that we're dealing with. We're in the bullseye, of this climate change that we're dealing with today. As far as what the bill can help us with, I want to point to infrastructure, which is our roads and more roads, bridges. We have to strengthen our bridges. We really need a strong power grid to get renewable energy to rural areas and to Native American lands. The idea of having broadband is really wonderful for small farms to get their produce to market faster. Water infrastructure, that's huge for New Mexico. We need water treatment. We need lots of storage capacity. We need reuse. Cybersecurity and attacks on our flood warning system, that's huge. Cleanup for abandoned wells and Superfund sites. We have tons of these, too many. We are an oil and gas producing state like Texas, and we have a lot of abandoned wells, and just so happens these abandoned wells are near agricultural lands and cultural sites that are really important to us. Let's see, I like the make drought, wildlife and wildfire and Interior Department investments in the budget reconciliation. But we want to see more details, like what are the details behind that? And then, I don't know if you want me to address, what falls short. Ian, do you want me to quickly go over that? So where it falls short is, we know, clean renewable energy tax credits. We're already on the path to get to 100% by 2035, 2040. We're one of the few states that already has a policy in place called the Energy Transition Act. So we will get there, but these tax credits would help us get there faster. We do not have enough funding for water planning, ag planning, climate planning, and being able to fund those plans. That's a very important element. These kinds of plans are created at the grassroots level, at the local level, and we want to have more control over how we spend that money. So what we'd like to see in the bill, more funding for climate and water planning to address environmental justice and racism, more funding to fund these plans and be able to have money to implement the plans. We need to invest in science at the local level. And I'll give you an example of that. We need to select or develop a New Mexico specific land surface hydrology model. That's really important for a dry climate. We have a range of hydroclimate found in New Mexico, as I described above. If we want to produce projects of water resources and the environment that are useful for planning purposes, it should thoroughly evaluate existing models and either select one or commission one that can be used with confidence for our state. We're really glad to see the new polluter fees for methane and carbon imports. That's huge for us. Advance equity transparency. To me, this is the biggest one. Advance equity transparency and the implementation of directing resources to underserved communities. We just need to see that trickle down. Like, how do we know it's going to get to our underserved communities? And then lastly, I just wanted to mention farm workers. Our farm workers here in New Mexico need workman's comp and livable wages and working hours that work with our changing climate. So thank you for listening to that.
Edie, would you like to jump in next?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I want to talk about just some background on Texas, and then lead into why this bill is so important. Texas leads the nation in fossil fuel energy production. We're a world leader in oil and gas production. We also rank #1 in greenhouse gas emissions. But Texas is also a leader in wind energy production. We're the #1 state. When it comes to solar, we're #2 in the nation, just behind California. So with that being said, that if we could change Texas, I think we could change the world. And that's why I think it is so important that Texas receive funding from this bill, particularly around, and I'm sorry, I had my video off. I apologize. I didn't mean to do that midway. So that's why it's so important to have funding for renewable energy here in Texas to get us to a clean transition to clean energy. So on a state level, like there are states that have these climate plans, like to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, to get to, renewable energy by X amount of date, 2035, 2040, whichever it was. We don't have that here in Texas. We have a lot of cities, San Antonio, Austin, Houston, Dallas, that have climate plans, but on a statewide level, we don't have that big plan that's going to help us get off of these fossil fuels, from using it to producing it, that will lead us into a sustainable future. Because we have a very conservative government. It has been very red since the 1990s. And until we can get more funding for infrastructure here in Texas, for more solar, for more wind, for battery storage, it's going to be hard to get off of fossil fuels. So one thing that I did like about this bill was the $17 billion that Mariana mentioned for ports, and some of that money going to the reduction of truck emissions. For example, Port Laredo, which is down along the border of Mexico, is the #1 inland port in the United States. 16,000 trucks go between Mexico and Texas every single day. That diesel emissions is obviously polluting the air down there, affecting air quality, affecting our children with respiratory illnesses, senior citizens with respiratory illnesses. And so it bothers me that one of the 9 reps, Henry Cuellar, who has the ability, Congressman Cuellar, who has the ability to really affect this bill, that's his district. Like, why is he, like, I find it so concerning that he would want to put some type of roadblock to this to this bill when knowing that this money could directly benefit his community. It could directly benefit Laredo. I think it's like almost 30, if not just over 30% of the people live within the federal poverty level. So those are people that are most impacted by climate change, by air pollution. And so I really would like to make sure like we focus on that area, because that's the part of Texas that could use it a lot.
Now, Didi, are there things that you see as real missing from the bill, or?
Yeah, the biggest thing that is we're needing is the energy, the energy tax and the tax credits for renewable energy. We need that here in Texas if we're going to get off of fossil fuels. If we're going to stop, like West Texas, out in the Permian, which we share the Permian Basin with the southern part of New Mexico. That's the largest oil producing basin in the world. So the only way we're going to get off this is if we can have, credits and funding and the clean energy standard for more renewable energy.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I think the fossil fuel concerns, the agricultural concerns, I think this is something that is shared across all three of our states, most certainly. Coming from the headwater state, we're having this conversation now with our three states, but we could be having this conversation with Colorado, Arizona, Utah, Wyoming, California, to be talking about the Colorado River, which is in desperate need of reforms along water use across all of them. Or the water that leaves Colorado from my own community here in Denver, Colorado, the South Platte, that eventually makes its way to the Mississippi and to the Gulf of Mexico with more than a dozen states. I've said for a long time, I feel like Colorado has a deep responsibility as the headwater state to ring the alarm. The same concerns that people have about shortened growing seasons and snowpack is something we see very real. We do have an oil and gas industry that needs to transition, but we also have an outdoor economy and a recreation economy and a tourism economy that really is reliant on this water. We don't have skiing, we don't have outdoor recreation with fires, we don't have rural communities getting access to those tourism dollars. That has a huge impact, on my community. We have agriculture. Maybe many people don't know this, but the San Luis Valley, where my ancestors called home, actually produces the second most amount of potatoes behind Idaho in the United States, right? So we have peaches on the western slope and pears. We just 2 years ago, we had one of the largest crop losses of peaches that we've ever seen. And it devastates communities. It leads to foreclosure. It leads to corporate consumption of land from small communities and small farmers into corporate conglomerates. And, it is the big polluters, both from agriculture, from oil and gas, that are the ones that are harming our community. Rural broadband is something that I hear constantly. And I do think that rural broadband could lead to reducing some pressures that we're seeing here in large cities like mine with gentrification. If I had the choice to live and work somewhere where I had reliable internet and access to a job where I could do that, I would much rather live in the high country, I think, than down here in the city where we're seeing our air pollution grow ever worse. As far as the energy transition goes, you're right. We need to do something drastically about these abandoned and orphan wells. Not only are they leaking methane, which is only contributing to this problem, they're leading to explosions and death. My great grandfather lives in a town, still alive, where there was a flow line that was abandoned and exploded and killed several people just blocks from his house, right? And what we're seeing is, and at least in my community, where my grandfather's from, is that rural pressure, what used to be rural isn't rural anymore. It's now suburban context, or it's on the edge of suburban context. But back then, those flow lines were built, we didn't even have a map of them. We need maps, we need plans, and we need closure. And what we're seeing is people being pushed into these situations where they're adding housing. And whenever there's money to be made, it seems to me that there are corners that are willing to be cut. And unfortunately, that's impacting people in our communities. The other thing, being the state director for Colorado, I'm about to finish my last trip to go to all 64 counties in Colorado. I've had a chance to talk to people at taco trucks, congressional representatives around the state of Colorado, talking to people about what they need. We talk about rural transportation. I want to be clear. Yes, we need to build bridges. Yes, we need to repair roads, but there is a very large difference between expansion and regular maintenance. And I would really like to see an investment in public transportation for that reason. I'll give you an example where, again, you have these cities that are growing that were once rural, but now they're kind of a hub for themselves, one being Pueblo, Colorado. Well, you might have large employers like the prison industrial complex that are in towns that are near here. But what we see are people driving back and forth every day, and no solutions that are being offered to them for regional transportation. In this specific example that I'm talking about, if we build transit, we're also building access for equity to reconnect families. We've seen how the criminal justice system has been really harmful to our communities for a very long time. And so I think being able to reconnect families, it also allows for outdoor equity and access. They can be win-win-wins, and we can expand rural transportation. But rural transportation isn't the only solution, because if you just build good transit, but you don't build affordable housing where workers are, what you end up with is segregated down valley communities. And we see this very intensely in Colorado, where uncompensated Latinas in particular and service workers are traveling more than an hour and a half each way to go to a job where they're not making livable wages necessarily, maybe needing 2 jobs or having to cohabitate in their communities just to be able to afford to live here. So, we definitely need housing. I definitely think housing needs to be a larger part of this conversation. If you know me, I'm also a homeless advocate. I believe access to water and housing and house keys are all very important pieces of this pie. And I do want to say, this is also about infrastructure, that we need to remind ourselves that concrete, asphalt are made in our communities, right? So if we're inducing demand for infrastructure by funding it, but we're not talking about mitigating the harms, so actually what we're doing is increasing the pollution in our communities. And we definitely, I don't think, want to see that. As far as electrification goes, whether it be EV charging stations or light trucks, which I hear a lot from UDD. I grew up in a community that was next to a train interchange modal where they go from trains to trucks. And what I hear from these people is like tax credits aren't enough. We need down payment assistance. If you want to see people make a change, you need down payment assistance. I think we saw that with Clash for Clunkers years ago for upgrading people and upgrading emissions. We're going to need those kind of options. I think tax credits, as I've seen it and as my community and our community has talked to us, are for elite people who have the money sitting aside that they can fork up in the beginning in order to get refunded in later on. And that just simply won't work for people who are working 2 jobs. Now, I also want to say, home healthcare workers is something that President Biden had talked a lot about. I'm a caregiver for my grandmother. It is more than a full-time job. And I have so much respect for people who are taking, especially Latinas, who are taking care of their grandma, their family, their kids. They have a job and they're not being compensated for it. And that is why they have the largest wage disparities. And as a Latino man, it pisses me off that we continue to have this problem after we've talked about it for years and years. And so I definitely want to make sure that reconciliation does something to drastically change the investments in our communities and to do something about these wage disparities. I guess lastly, I want to say, the renewable energy future is so important. And again, I want to talk about, just 2 communities. One where I grew up next to, which has a refinery, 2 oil terminals, pipelines that one comes from Texas, where they're spilling massive amounts of benzene. There's all this other complex pollution there. We had a coal plant that went to a dirty fracked gas plant. And they said, they told us to say thank you for that. We need to be closing these plants. We need to be remediating these Superfund sites. Again, I talked about Pueblo, Colorado and Southern Colorado. This is a community that has the largest coal producing plant, the largest greenhouse gas emitter, and it is surrounded by a Latino neighborhood. And guess what? They don't even access that electricity. They have a different company that produces electricity for them that actually charges the highest rates in the state of Colorado and spent millions of dollars in defeating a municipalization effort. So if that's not environmental justice, where you're taking the largest pollution source in the entire state and you're paying the highest energy rates, that's just simply unacceptable. And so if we can help get people to get the down payment assistance, if we can help do the education for our communities, I think we can curve that demand and change it for the better, which will result in cleaner air. I could go on more and more because it's like 1,000 pages long, but I think so in alignment with the same concerns that I think we're sharing as these agricultural land-based communities who have been subjected to environmental racism for a long time. And there are dollars in here that can help us undo those harms. Now, Mariana, I don't know if you want to take questions from the community, or Dee, maybe you have something to say back. I mean, we can have a conversation here too, Teresa. I think it's just great. The alignment seems so real to me.
Yeah, definitely. This is an open conversation. So Didi, Teresa, any other thoughts? And, you know, for the folks listening, put in the chat if there's anything that, you know, that you're seeing that's missing, that you're thinking that is benefiting our communities. We'd love to hear from you as well.
I'd like to know, you know, I'm from Texas, Ian, Colorado, Teresa, New Mexico. Just our states alone, like how much need there is for this bill. And then there's so many other places in the United States that need, you know, need funding as well. How will the money be determined? How does it filter to communities, especially the communities that need it the most, that are suffering the most from pollution and climate change and water scarcity, food insecurity, everything?
Yes, Dee, that's an interesting question. I did in my little 10-minute presentation, I did talk about that equity issue around, you know, how does this money reach where it really needs to go? And I can cite an example, and I'm dealing with that now here in New Mexico. And that is, we have excess CARES Act money that is going unspent. And, you know, we don't want to give that back to the federal government. So how do we spend this money, and how do you equitably share it? And who's going to be at the table to talk about that? So one of the sort of smaller projects that I'm working on here is to make a presentation in front of the legislature and talk about this concern about where this money is going to be, where it's going to be spent, and if it's equitable. And if you feel like it's not going to be well spent, and those voices are not being heard, then we were going to propose council, and it was going to be around, you know, water resources, because we're really worried about that sort of trickle down effect. So we wanted to propose maybe putting a council together, and it's that council that sits around the table and comes to consensus on how the money is going to be spent, with that environmental justice lens right over it. So that's sort of one sort of strategy that communities can do, because of the fact that it is federal money, and if you don't know the details, you know, devil's in the details, then, you know, where's that guidance on, you know, on how the money's going to get spent? So that group of people need to have this consensus conversation around that. So that's just an example.
Well, in my thought process on it, I think that now is the time to be having those conversations. You know, when you can call up your senator, which I hope you do, and your representatives when you get off the phone today, or if you're watching on Facebook Live, jump on your Google, find that number, give those people a call and start that conversation and say, you know, President Biden had committed to an environmental justice 40%, but we know goals are meaningless if we don't find ways to implement them. You know, I have seen breakdowns on what dollars are coming back to my community, or at least estimates. And I think that GreenLatinos can work with you all to figure that out. Teresa, you're totally right. It's going to be about movement at the state legislature, right? So first step in my mind is, well, I don't know if it's a first step. We probably have to jump with 2 feet at the same time, which is continuing the dialogue with our state legislatures, at the same time continuing our conversation with congressional leaders. You know, when it comes to the state legislature and we talk about equity, you know, a lot of times you'll see dollars like this come in with matching. And it's very difficult for low income and poor rural communities to match. And so I think we're going to have real conversations with that. I also think we need to be innovative about how we can take other funds and pair them together. You know, water infrastructure, for example, with unhoused, I think, you know, it could be housing dollars, it could be water infrastructure dollars, it could be emergency management dollars. That's how we've been trying to bring it together to pull dollars together, at least at the city level, about this work. And you know, I think the state legislature depends on how, I don't know how your states are necessarily set up. My legislature only meets 5 times a year, and so, or 5 months a year from January to May. They do have interim committee meetings, and so we're kind of in the thick of that right now about how to spend these last dollars. I would also say, you know, we need to be talking about how we get plans in place with these funding mandates, because this is over 5 years, and who knows who will be the president directing these agencies. And so whatever we can do to concretely change the way in which the administrative agencies operate will mean for longer success for our communities. Because if we end up continuing what I've seen in my lifetime, which is pinballing back and forth between policy that harms us and policy that doesn't harm us, but the consultants and some people are making a lot of money, because it definitely costs money to put on these hearings and do all these things, but the policy is just going back and forth. And so I think we need to be pushing outside of just this bill to really enshrine changes to the agencies that take less purview away from who is in charge at the time.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. I think now is definitely the time. It's the time to make your voices heard. It's the time to call your representatives at the federal level. It's the time to get involved at the local level and ask those questions to the administration of how is this money getting back to our local communities? I think it's a really great point. I do want to keep in mind that we have 10 minutes left. If there's any final thoughts, any closing thoughts from each of you, that would be amazing.
Yes, I do. I have one closing thought. It kind of echoes what Ian's saying and what Dee Dee is saying. You know, to work at the local level. So here in New Mexico, we have implemented climate plans. So those climate plans can really need to come from your cities or your counties. And if you have these plans in place, these are consensus building tools that will allow you to have collective voice when it's time to go visit your legislature and when it's time to look at all that money that's coming from the federal government. You have the plan in place, you have your needs, you've done your assessments, you've brought people together in community, you've got a common ground that you built together. That consensus building is the most important element of the community voice, and just really an important tool to have in order to spend this money in a way that is environmentally, that has social justice in it. You know, to have that ingrained in the, you know, in all of the needs that are collected.
I want to say thank you to GreenLatinos for having this this forum, because it's so important for you know, this is a lot of information to digest. I think y'all said it was like over 1,000 pages, and Mariana managed to condense it to something understandable in a matter of like almost 10 minutes. So appreciate this space to learn and hear other people's stories. I think it's so important for organizations like GreenLatinos to keep on doing this, right? But because they're centering our voices, right? They're centering Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. in these conversations. So like if you have an opportunity at your local level, at your state level to insert yourself into these discussions, please do, because we cannot leave it to the bureaucrats to take care of this money, right? To filter it down to wherever. I'm pointing to Henry Cuellar again. He is my congressman, but just the other day he was touring a coal plant and talking about the need to build out more natural gas infrastructure because Texas froze, the entire state froze back in February, but it was those exact natural gas plants that failed. So first of all, he's just not really understanding the problem here in Texas. And if he has it his way, we're not going to get the money that we need in our communities to make our lives better, our air better, to have a sustainable future. So please, wherever you can get involved in these conversations around infrastructure funding, please do it. And once again, thanks GreenLatinos for having me, all of us.
Yeah, Dee, I mean, I really appreciated what you had to say, you too, Teresa. I just want us to continue coming together, both across state lines and in rural and urban communities, because when large amounts of money come forward, it provides a lot of opportunity for us to fight with each other. And often what I've seen when there's settlement dollars against polluters, they shrink the dollars till they're small, and then they break them up, small grants that make us compete against each other. It's part of divide and conquer mentality that is very clear to me. Wasn't as clear to me, I think, 10 years ago, but it's definitely something that I see now. And so I really just want to encourage everyone again to like be reaching across that, to be building your networks, to use GreenLatinos as a way to build your network. You know, if you're watching this and you're like, wow, I don't know all my members, we can help pull a list. We can help connect you. We have Zooms to bring you together. You know, we're only as strong as the ideas, I think, that come forward from our community as well. I know, you know, you might be watching this and you live in Wisconsin or Minnesota and you say, I want to have a conversation about that. Can you help me find the tools to do that? Well, Mariana's great at making fact sheets. I can help you make fact sheets. We can talk about that. But I think we're also we got to put our, I used to say pedal to the floor because that's like a car metaphor, but that, unless you have an electric vehicle, maybe pedal on the bicycle. But, you know, we're in this time right now for a few weeks where this window of opportunity is that I have not seen again in my lifetime. And so we're going to have to push for that. And then if we're successful, we should really take the opportunity to celebrate that success. This is something that Mark has really mentored me about as my boss. You know, we passed incredible legislation. Teresa, you're talking about incredible legislation in your state. In Colorado, we passed environmental justice offices in our Department of Transportation, right? We need to take that victory lap. And you know what? When we walk proud on our victories, we bring more people into the movement. And so, again, I just want to thank you for this. And I want to ask you, if you're tuned in here, to go to GreenLatinos Facebook, to make a comment, to like it, to share it to groups you belong to. Even you know, it's that power of using the internet and the tools for us collectively that helps us do any more than we could ever buy with social media ads. And so you know, power to the people, and thank you again so much, because it's time that we put the front lines to the front of the line, and that is the message that we took to the White House.
Yes, that's correct. And that's where we're here for. GreenLatinos is definitely a resource for all of you. Please, like Ian said, go to our Facebook, share this video. You can go to our website, sign up for our newsletter so you can stay updated. We also have working groups. We have a climate change and clean air working group. We have a water equity working group. Come together and look and see opportunities where you can also get involved. Our mission is to make sure that you have access, and so that's something that we are truly passionate about and are here to help. With that said, thank you again to our panelists. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Didi. Thank you, Teresa, for being here in this space, for sharing your knowledge, and for doing the work that you're doing on the ground. We really appreciate everything that everyone here is doing. And thank you all for joining. Thank you all for taking the time. And again, please stay connected. Muchas gracias, and have a great rest of your week.